Hi, everyone. I think we're going to get started. Thank you all so much for joining this webinar. My name is Judah Axelrod. I'm a senior data scientist with the Office of Race and Equity Research at the Urban Institute. And today we're going to be talking about localities' challenges and best practices in using data and equity-driven arguments to select transportation projects and submit successful applications for competitive federal grant opportunities. I'm going to get us started with a quick presentation of our findings from interviews with local stakeholders. Then I'll pass over to my colleague, Carolina Ramos, to discuss the data guide that we are about to release to assist future grant applicants. We'll then pause for a quick Q&A on any of that material. And finally, we'll turn things over to my colleague, Sam Fu, with three speakers who have been involved with past applications for funding available under the bipartisan infrastructure law, who will participate in a panel discussion. And we'll incorporate further questions from the audience into that conversation. First, just a few housekeeping notes. The event is being recorded and the recording will be posted online afterwards. Slides are also available online at urban.org. You can hide captions or adjust your settings with the live transcript button on your screen. We have all participants muted, but you can type any questions and comments you have into the Q&A box at any time, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. And please do stick around and complete the survey at the end of the event to give us your feedback. Okay, so to get us started, transitioning away from car-centric transportation projects to investments in bike, pedestrian, and public transit initiatives has important implications for racial equity. We know that people of color are underrepresented as personal vehicle owners, even though they face a disproportionate amount of the risks from pollution from vehicle emissions and injuries and fatalities due to vehicle crashes. We also know that access to public transit is highly inequitable in many of our cities, with white, educated, and higher income residents having often greater and easier access to public transit options. And finally, walking and biking is more popular for lower income Americans than it is for higher income Americans, with cycling being fastest growing as a mode of transportation for people of color. And as many of us already know, the racial inequities that we see in the current transportation landscape are the result of decades of structural racism in the forms of exclusionary zoning, redlining, urban renewal, and disinvestment. So against that backdrop of inequality, the passage of three important policies by the Biden administration has created a new opportunity for investments in transportation that advance racial equity and environmental justice. These landmark policies include, first, the executive order on advancing racial equity, which requires federal agencies to assess the extent to which their programs and policies perpetuate systemic barriers to opportunity for people of color and underserved groups. Second, the Justice 40 initiative, which aims to deliver 40% of the overall benefits from federal investments in categories including clean transit to disadvantaged communities. And third, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or the bipartisan infrastructure law, which allocates nearly $600 billion in federal funding for transportation projects specifically. And we're seeing that many competitive federal grants are newly asking applicants to make data-driven arguments to demonstrate how their proposed projects will benefit disadvantaged communities. And just as a note here, the term disadvantaged communities is defined by the White House, and it's a point of contention as many, including us, have called for more asset-based language and criticized the methodology used to identify these communities. So just for the sake of consistency with federal guidance, this is the term that we're going to use throughout the webinar, but just wanted to include that note as a caveat. Great, so I'm now going to just talk briefly about the research that we recently published that lifts up the perspectives of local leaders applying for competitive grant funding available under the infrastructure bill. This research is linked in the related materials section of the event page for your reference. So for this brief, we conducted 20 interviews with local and regional government agency reps, community-based organizations, and consultants who support the grant writing process. These folks worked in transportation and in brownfields revitalization. These are two policy areas with clear connections to racial equity issues that are covered under the infrastructure bill. 10 of these interviews were with actors in the transportation space, and 3 of them are actually here with us today as panelists, and we'll hear from them a little bit more later. We asked them questions about the data-related challenges they encountered, how they went about embedding equity throughout the application lifecycle, and lessons that they learned throughout the process. Finally, I'll just touch on some of the biggest challenges we uncovered from those interviews. They kind of fall into 3 main themes. And we'll hear from panelists a little bit later about some of the best practices in addressing some of these challenges. So first, we heard that applicants struggled to quantify racial equity and environmental justice particularly in the face of unclear or still developing guidance from federal agencies. We heard that applicants feared deviating from existing guidance, and this could take on multiple forms. It could include using their own positive language in place of the term disadvantaged communities, such as equity-focused communities or priority populations. It could also include implementing a custom methodology for something like a benefit cost analysis, which would attempt to calculate not just how much benefit would be generated, but which specific communities would be benefiting from a potential project. Second, we heard that applicants faced obstacles in accessing and analyzing the necessary data sources to put together successful projects. This ranged from data sharing just across agencies within the same town or city to working with the publicly available data that might be at the state or the federal level. We heard a lot about the importance of GIS knowledge specifically to be able to conduct place-based analysis and overlay multiple indicators at once to paint a fuller picture. This proved to be a high barrier to entry for many that we spoke to. And finally, we heard that the quality of community engagement was highly variable. In some instances, it was treated more as a box to check to satisfy the grant requirement, rather than a perspective to be incorporating thoughtfully throughout a project. Urban's Community Engaged Methods team has published many resources on best practices for meaningful engagement and can share that in the chat. And then the other two challenges I mentioned kind of serve more as a motivation for our data guide, which I'll now turn things over to my colleague Carolina to talk more about.
Thank you so much, Judah, and hi, everyone. My name is Carolina Ramos. I'm a policy associate at the Urban Institute. And as Judah said, I'm excited to turn to an overview of our forthcoming data guide, which will be published next week, and addresses two of the key takeaways that Judah shared. So first, that applicants can struggle to quantify racial equity and environmental justice metrics, and two, that they can face challenges in accessing and analyzing data sources that they need for funding applications. So this data guide is designed for local governments and organizations that are interested in applying for federal funds with a racial equity lens, and particularly looks at projects focused on public transportation, bicycle, and pedestrian initiatives. The guide showcases data sources and data tools that can help applicants make decisions about what types of projects to pursue with an equity focus, and to make the case for the need for those projects, as well as speaking to any specific equity themes that commonly appear in funding guidelines and applications. The guide does not serve as a step-by-step application guide for pursuing infrastructure bill funds or other federal transportation funds. Agencies will have specific criteria for funding and application evaluation processes, and we'd encourage you to look directly to those agencies for more specific guidance on the ins and outs of the application process. What the guide does do is capture data sources and tools across 6 core categories that we chose based on common themes that we saw occurring in notice of funding opportunities for infrastructure bill programs and other federal transportation funding applications. The guide contains more in-depth descriptions of each of these categories and sample data sources for each. So I'm not going to go too in-depth on the categories here, but what I will do is preview the Airtable, which is going to be launching accompanying the data guide next week. And really the goal of the Airtable is to make this information more accessible and searchable. So as you can see, the Airtable is an accompanying piece to the data guide that contains 97 entries of indicators and data sources across the 6 data categories that we mentioned. It includes filters for topic areas, information on the data type and the data source, as well as information on geographic coverage and levels of geographic granularity for a given data source. Also covers things like time span and periodicity for each data indicator, the extent to which the data is disaggregated by key characteristics, so things like race and sex, and each of them also include a link to the data set itself, and wherever possible, link to any technical documentation and sort of additional guidance on how to use the data. Almost all of these entries are nationally available, and many of them are available down to the census block group level, which allows users to pull data that's capturing a more relevant, more local context. It's definitely not an exhaustive list, but it is meant to be a starting point for applicants, and wherever possible, we definitely encourage localities to pair these types of sources with your own local data. To really ensure that the data categories and the data sources that we compiled are relevant to funds that local governments and organizations would be seeking, we reviewed notices of funding opportunities, or NOFOs, for both new and existing programs under the infrastructure bill. So the language that you see here of these common priorities are pulled directly from these NOFOs as themes that applicants are expected to address. And the themes reflect the dual challenges and priorities that Judah spoke to earlier. There's a need to combat climate change and center environmental justice. There's also a real pressing need to address the needs of priority communities that have historically, at best, not benefited from federal investments, and at worst have been actively harmed by public policies. In the guide, we highlight indicators across the data categories that are present in the Airtable that are relevant to each of these priorities. So we'll spotlight one of these now as an example. So let's look at this priority around increasing mobility, connectivity, and accessibility, especially for non-motorized travelers. So this is language that's found under the Raise Discretionary Grant, which identifies non-motorized travelers as pedestrians, cyclists, and my personal favorite, rollers. So people who are using scooters, skateboards, rollerblades, for instance. It also includes people who are using public transit under the Raise definition. So essentially anyone who's not primarily relying on a car for their travel. And we know from Judah's presentation earlier that this is predominantly households of color and households with lower incomes. So let's start with demographic indicators. So this could be information like poverty rates and median income. It could be information around particular communities, so racial demographics or people with disabilities, any priority community who could benefit from the particular project or investment that you're proposing. And we describe this in more detail in the guide, but really there's a way to incorporate and sort of weave demographic indicators throughout your application narratives to give a firmer sense of the communities you serve and their distinct needs. Under mobility and connectivity, you can look at the number of vehicles per household to give you a sense of how many households may be lacking a vehicle and are transit dependent. And then walkability can give a sense of how pedestrian friendly an area is to households without a vehicle. Safety is another really important element of this. Do people who get around without a car even feel safe doing so? And so looking at federal data on vehicle crashes involving pedestrians and cyclists can shape understanding of this safety dimension. And it can also help you sort of target and highlight specific geographies or maybe intersections where investments might be needed to improve safety and the feasibility and comfort of using non-motorized transport. Jumping to the environmental category, there's a related indicator here around tree cover and tree canopy along walkable roads. So this is another one that can really shape the comfort and the ease of mobility for non-motorized travelers, because areas with more tree cover and more shade tend to have lower temperatures, and that makes non-motorized travel more comfortable and more safe. Research has also shown that communities with lower incomes tend to have less tree canopy. So this is another one that can reflect aspects of equity within your community. And finally, in addressing this theme, applicants can consider economic and housing dimensions. So looking at jobs that are available within a half mile of a transit stop can provide insight on how well connected non-motorized travelers are to key opportunities and economic centers. And moreover, beyond that, thinking beyond just economic connectivity, thinking about other key destinations like healthcare centers, recreation centers and parks, schools, to get a much fuller picture of where people may or may not readily have access to key destinations. And related to that, if we're thinking about housing, data on residential segregation can also show who may be facing structural barriers to accessing those key destinations, or where there may be communities that are experiencing a spatial mismatch between where housing and jobs are located. Each of these data points in isolation can reflect equity dynamics for a given topic, but together, applicants can really use them to develop a data-driven narrative about community needs.
Great, thanks so much, Carolina. So we have a few minutes just to answer a couple questions before we move on to the panel discussion. So again, please do add any questions you have in the Q&A box and we'll take a look at them. I can start with what's come in so far. So we've got a question about how the data sources were chosen in the Airtable that Carolina just walked through before. And I can take that one. So our team kind of conducted research to find sources and data tools that aligned best with the categories that Carolina outlined earlier in her presentation. We also included kind of some internal review with folks at Urban who either might have had experience in working with that particular data source or that tool, or who just broadly had expertise in that given topic area. This helped us to kind of go back and add any sources we might have missed and make revisions to ensure all the information was accurate. I will say there's certainly other data sources that we intentionally excluded from that table. Common reasons for this were if the source wasn't granular enough, if it was too outdated or not updated frequently enough, or it maybe didn't generalize beyond just a small set of geographies. But I will say, as Kelly said, this is not meant to be an exhaustive list of every data source that one might use, but more of a strong starting point, and certainly something that's meant to be kind of used in conjunction with any state or local data that you might have access to on your own. Okay, looking for other questions. Got a question about whether or not the data sources in the Airtable will be updated. Thanks for that question. Our plan is not to update the sources that you're seeing here. Again, kind of meant more to be a starting point for applicants to reference in the development of project proposals. Certainly as any errors come up, we'll absolutely update the table to fix them. But the plan is for this table to be published along with the forthcoming data guide, hopefully or sometime late next week. Great. And I think we have time for one more question. The question about data sources being used for the impact evaluation phase of a project. Carolina, do you want to jump in on this one?
Sure. And then also seeing one more question in the chat that I can answer quickly. So someone asked if the data guide will be available next week and will it be free for all users. So yes, it'll be available by the end of next week. It is totally free for everyone. So that'll be a narrative data guide and then the accompanying data table with that. Everyone who participates today will also be on an email list. So as soon as it's published, we'll send that out to you. To this question around impact evaluation, this is definitely can be challenging. How do you quantify impact? How do you determine a causal relationship between a given investment and an outcome, especially if you're looking for a priority community? This guide really focuses on earlier in the project phase. So it focuses more on project selection. It focuses on how you can think about where there might be high areas of need or communities that have faced historic disinvestment, who can now be priorities for new funds coming through. There are a couple of resources at Urban and at peer institutions that we can drop in the chat that give more guidance on how to do monitoring and evaluation and impact assessments with a specific racial equity lens. So we can certainly drop those in the chat and also share them afterward to make sure everyone has those.
Great, and I think with that, we're now going to turn to our panel of local transportation experts with experience in developing data-driven funding applications. So I'll turn things over to my colleague, Samantha Fu, to kick us off.
Thank you, Judah. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Samantha Fu. I'm a policy associate at the Urban Institute's Research to Action Lab, and I have the distinct pleasure of introducing you to the three panelists joining us today to share their experiences applying for federal funding for transportation projects, and specifically for programs funded by the Infrastructure Act, such as RAISE, Infra, and Safe Streets and Roads for All. First, we have Kristen Moat, who is Vice President and Director of Smart Mobility Planning at Modern Mobility Partners, which is a Georgia-based transportation planning and traffic engineering consulting firm. Next, we have Maria Schopper, Associate Director of Transportation Planning at the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission, which is Central Ohio's metropolitan planning organization. And last but certainly not least, we have Vineet Gupta, who is the Director of Policy and Planning at the Boston Transportation Department. Kristen, Maria, and Vineet, welcome and thank you so much for being here today. Before we dive into the panel discussion, I just want to take a minute to remind our audience members that we will be taking questions in the Q&A box throughout the panel and not just at the end. So please feel free to drop your questions into the box at any time, and we'll do our best to incorporate them into the discussion. All right, so as Judah noted in his presentation, in the wake of President Biden's executive orders on racial equity and addressing the climate crisis, many federal agencies, including the Department of Transportation, are incorporating new criteria into their grant applications for competitive grant funding, requiring applicants to address the equity implications of their proposed projects. I'd like to start the conversation by hearing about how each of your organizations has approached incorporating racial equity considerations in your planning and execution of transportation projects. Vineet, would you like to start us off?
Sure, and again, thank you for inviting me, but it's really exciting research. I think it's going to make a qualitative difference to the applications that communities might be kind of focused on for federal programs. So here in Boston, we, in advance of some of the federal programs that have been rolled out, have been focused on equity. And we've done that principally from what direction was given to us by our citywide mobility plan, Go Boston 2030. And among many goals and metrics that plan identified, one of them was to focus in on communities that have been historically underserved. And so whether it's a new project or whether it's a program to help communities in those underserved areas, much of our capital investment has gone in that direction. And later on in the conversation, I can talk about some of the programs specifically, but that has been our fundamental approach to our capital plan and to where we are focusing our resources. The second piece that kind of drives a lot of what we do is trust building within those same communities. And our community engagement has taken a kind of a quantum shift in how we have conversations with the community. Gone is the old model where we do town hall meetings, where there is us and them kind of atmosphere. What we do now, and this is fundamental to getting trust within communities, is that we engage local community-based organizations, local leaders, local champions, and pay them just like we pay technical consultants. These are people we are paying for their lived experience. And they run the community process for us. And they manage the community process for us. Of course, city officials stay engaged. It's our responsibility to take decisions. But so that's another way that equity has become a core part of what we do here. I'll save the data piece for later on, and I can talk to you about how we are structured relative to the data.
Yes, no, that's great, Vineet. Kristen, interested in hearing about your experience working with cities and regions all across the Southeast. Are you seeing some of what Vineet mentioned as well?
I think we're seeing some of it. I think, the biggest challenge that we've run into recently with grant applications is, a project sponsor has been planning on applying for a project for several years. And then when we get to the application process, we realize that perhaps not so much has been done on the equity side, or not as much as is really needed. So we're finding that sometimes we have to go back and kind of retrofit an equity analysis, and we've been able to take advantage of several free online tools like the CDC Social Vulnerability Index, which is kind of a combination of several of the indicators that you all have talked about, and can kind of give an overview. But again, the challenge with that is we can identify whether or not a project is located in a disadvantaged community, but it's still hard to quantify the impacts that project is going to have specifically on that community and specifically to quality of life. But we've had other sponsors similar to the experience up in Boston who, have been working on equity, and equity is more centered focused in everything that they do. And those applications have generally been more successful.
Maria, anything to add based on your experience in Ohio?
Yeah, so, as you mentioned, we are the metropolitan planning organization for the Columbus urbanized area. And, so we have traditionally incorporated environmental justice analyses into our process, and, have since the early 2000s included project selection criteria for both our metropolitan transportation plan and the transportation improvement program that, the criteria that evaluates the proportion of project users that are minority, low income, elderly, and disabled. But as we've been researching best practices and exploring better ways to address equity, we realize, and I know we will dive into this later in the discussion, but the technical data-driven components are really challenging. And so we started by taking a look at our advisory committees and our working groups. As as an MPO, we have many. And so we're starting with our community advisory committee. We've really focused on making sure we have diverse representation guiding the process as we dig into the data and technical methods. So in the past year or so, we've really made some significant changes to the committee makeup to be
more diverse and representative and bringing more voices to the table. And as a result, have begun making some significant changes to some of our longer standing technical processes, such as really examining how certain project selection criteria might conflict with each other. For example, how traditional economic development measures might conflict with safety measures, and how we apply those maybe to different networks. And then we've also expanded the target range of our funding for our attributable funding program to commit more funding to active transportation projects. And we're getting ready to, we're embarking on a new metropolitan transportation plan development cycle. And so I'm expecting to see some of those changes incorporated into that process as well.
That's really exciting. We've started to dive a little bit into this already on project selection criteria and specific metrics that are being used to evaluate projects, but I do want to spend a little more time on hearing the details of how your organizations have used data to help center racial equity, and specifically when it comes to the project selection phase of things, which is what our data guide focuses on, as Carolina mentioned. Vineet, do you have some thoughts you'd like to offer here?
Yeah, sure. And we here in Boston created selection criteria that now go back about 3 years. And there are kind of 3 pieces to it. The first has to do with racial makeup. And as I mentioned, we are trying to invest in neighborhoods that have been haven't seen any investment for decades. And invariably, those are neighborhoods that are more diverse. The second piece which we look at is safety. And so we have, over the last few years, created a high injury network. So these are corridors that have seen the most fatalities or serious injuries. And so if you are near one of those corridors, then, from a selection perspective, you have a better chance. The second piece is vulnerable communities. And, we have good data on where our disabled are living, where the elderly are, and where our youth are. And so those vulnerable populations are part of a selection criteria as well. And finally, we look at proximity to community facilities, whether it's a park or a library or some kind of a community center or a small business area. We take all of those into consideration. So we already had that framework that we put 3 years ago, but I just want to kind of point one thing out. It's one thing to have these criteria to select projects that are going to come in the future, but as a practical matter, because we've been doing capital plans for so many years before, in the most part, a lot of the money is going to our legacy projects, which were selected through criteria that probably won't kind of pass the sniff test today. And so there's that whole kind of, how do you change the direction of your capital investment plan over years? And so that's a challenge that, even though I'm kind of saying we have all these criteria, but the fact of the matter is that we're still constructing projects that were approved, 5 years ago, or sometimes even 10 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. And Kristen, I think you nodded to this earlier too, of having to retrofit equity analyses almost into the projects that you're working on. Would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Vineet is absolutely correct. There's a lot of projects that have been in the works for several years, and had or still have a need and a purpose, but may not have gone through the selection criteria or the equity analysis that we expect projects to go through today. So you do kind of have to retrofit. But getting back to the original question about like how are we integrating data, we have spatial analysts, GIS analysts that so a lot of our analysis is GIS based, and we do a lot of overlaying of layers, a lot of the indicators that you all have recommended and have put into that Airtable. One example that I can think of is a long range project that we're working on right now. We're trying to find trying to identify areas, opportunity areas for electric vehicle charging stations, and making sure that the distribution of those charging stations are equitable and are within close proximity to certain populations. So as the entire transportation fleet continues to move towards electrification, those things have already been thought about. So currently we're working on an analysis where we're overlaying equity emphasis areas / justice 40 disadvantaged communities, which include low income, zero vehicle, low English, disability, race and ethnicity, education level, aging, youths, community resources. And there are data sets that combine some of these together. So again, I mentioned some of the free tools that are out there, just researching equity tools, you should be able to find some decent resources. Then we overlay that with community resources like schools and parks and what we call food assets, which are grocery stores or farmers markets or places where people get their food, daycares, hospitals, libraries, etc. And then we overlaid all of that with multifamily and office locations. All of those we then combine with designated alternative fuel corridors, which are a designation by the feds on corridors that should be prioritized for electric vehicle charging. So we overlay all of those, and we can find little pockets where are major opportunity areas to make sure that the locations of those electric vehicle charging are in fact equitable and still meet the requirements from the feds for federal funding in the future.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. It does sound fairly involved, though, and I think this is something that we note in the data guide as well, that applying for federal funding often requires a high level of local capacity and preparedness, which is something I'm sure you're all intimately familiar with. So I'm wondering whether any of you would like to speak to suggestions you have for smaller cities or communities who may be less resourced on ways they can build their capacity and increase their preparedness to apply for these competitive federal opportunities when they come up.
I can jump in, or Maria, why don't you go? We haven't heard from you in a minute.
Well, I would just offer to really, here in Columbus, we pride ourselves on, regional collaboration. And so, leveraging your regional partners and your metropolitan planning organization or other regional planning entity, because, that's typical, there's can be where a lot of the resources are. We are lucky enough to have a really talented GIS and data staff here and are able to provide a lot of assistance for mapping data and analyses for our local members.
Just to add on to that, I think that there are more and more online tools that are becoming available that can be utilized, like online mapping or spatial analysis tools that can be leveraged. The other thing that I would recommend is, as you are thinking about applying for federal funding or as you're starting projects, one thing you can do is just give yourself more time. I do understand that, this federal transportation authorization is only good for a certain amount of time, and we don't know what the next bill is going to hold. But if you give yourself some extra time, then that will hopefully allow the limited resources that you have to be able to do all of the work and take their time and be able to do the analysis. Whereas if you try to expedite it to meet the next upcoming notice of funding, then you're going to be much more limited and stretched in your in-house resources.
Yes, absolutely. And I think we're starting to get into the territory of challenges. So this might be a good place for us to pause for a quick poll we have prepared to give our audience members a chance to weigh in on this next question we have. Folks in the audience, you should now see a question for you to respond to on screen. We're going to close the poll in about 60 seconds. So please respond as soon as you can. And let's just give folks a little bit of time. And maybe while we wait for those results to come in, our next question, as you might have guessed, is about the key challenges that your organizations have faced in using data to center racial equity in transportation projects. I'm seeing from the responses coming in that audience members are highlighting staffing capacity, which we've talked about. It's one of the biggest challenges, and then also just lack of data sources disaggregated by race or ethnicity. Maria, does that resonate with you? And are there any strategies that you would recommend to tackle these challenges?
Sure. So I think, yeah, every single one of those listed is something we're struggling with as well. One of the big ones is, I think current methods are largely based on transit access and vehicle travel. And, as, my fellow panelists have mentioned, that's what a lot of the, kind of legacy projects have been evaluated using. And, these are important methods, but, we really need better data and methods around biking and walking. We struggle with simply getting reliable bike and pedestrian count data regularly. For a while, we were doing volunteer-based manual counting on, key trail and sidewalk locations. And, so if we don't have reliable benchmarks and existing data, it makes it really difficult to do project evaluation, performance measurement, and target setting. And I guess I'd say the other challenge that we're having is, we rely on census data for most of our demographic data, and that is all very geographically based. And I think it may have been brought up previously, but that's great for identifying and locating the historically underserved and underinvested neighborhoods, and which is very useful in analyses. But we also know that people, they don't just stay in one block group. They're traveling outside of the block groups, and we also know that the people in these targeted population groups don't all live within 5 key census tracts in a region. So we want to do a better job of understanding who is using a particular facility or who will be the users of a particular project. And again, while we've established a good method of doing that for vehicular travel and via our travel demand model, we want to be able to do the same for transit and active transportation. And even then, that's model data, it's not actual data. That so those are our two, I'd say, main big challenges, as well as we do have staffing and technical, just the ability to get it all done. Like I said, we have a really talented staff, but we are really trying to do it, create a routed network. We've got great local data. We really want to get a routed network that combines our bike network, our sidewalk network, the trail network, and so we can actually do walk shed and bike shed analyses from our transit stops. But just that amount of labor and amount of work has been really cumbersome to get the time and energy to do. So those are I'd say those are our 3 main challenges.
I saw you come off mute, Vinny. Did you have anything to add to that?
No, I was saying that frankly, we've taken the easy way out. We've hired a consulting team on retainer, anticipating, a few, well, even before the federal programs really got going, but anticipating that there will be all these federal programs. After months and months of cajoling our budget department, I managed to get some money, promising big return on investment, to hire a consultant team that writes our applications for us. Because we have a fairly large staff, but people are too busy designing and managing construction to spend time on applications. And so that investment has paid off. we've been very successful with the race program for both rounds. We also use this consultant team to do evaluation for us, kind of the before and after picture. And we did that we've done that through ARPA funding. We got monies to do we directed some of our ARPA funding for a free fares program. So we have 3 bus routes that serve our poorest neighborhoods and serve our most transit dependent populations. And we made those routes free, and a very successful program. Ridership in one route is almost back to pre-pandemic levels, because people, ridership has gone up by 30%, 40% on these routes. And we have really good metrics to show how progress was made. And that's a story that we can tell when we put in applications for different kinds of projects. The
Yes.
data sources are all there in the Boston area, whether it's census-based or whether it's data that we do a lot of counts. The city does lots of counts ourselves. So we have all the data. It's just a matter of, as Maria was saying, kind of tabulating everything, doing the overlapping, figuring out what's more important. So we just kind of outsource that.
Right. And that's really interesting, given that the second biggest concern we're hearing from our audience is the lack of data disaggregated by race and ethnicity. So I'm interested in hearing from Kristen and Maria on whether you can zero in on a bit on some of the biggest data gaps that you've noticed in the cities and the regions that you're working on. Are there particular types of data that are difficult to find, whether at all or disaggregated?
Well, I think Maria hit on it pretty well. Just the lack of data that's out there for non-vehicular transportation. I know one grant application that we worked on, the project sponsor has trail counters, and they've been installing them as they've been building their trail system. And then as qualitative data, they're doing the intercept surveys, but it seems like so far we've really had to rely on that qualitative data in those onboard surveys or intercept surveys, or the public engagement piece to gather a lot of it. And again, it's not quantitative. So I think that's where the most opportunity is developing those data sets, whether it's through crowdsourcing, which may be, some sort of option. Of course, then you're dealing with the quality of the data, or, finding ways at a regional level or partnerships with other organizations to collect the data yourself.
Yes, and on the topic of the limits of quantitative data, I'm interested in hearing more about how your organizations think about pairing quantitative data with qualitative data, such as community input. Maria, I know you nodded to the fact that you have community advisory boards, and so interested to hear your take on that.
Yes, absolutely. At MORPC, we definitely see quantitative data and analyses as just one tool. And when evaluating projects, we literally go through project by project to make sure the numbers make sense. And even for the Metropolitan Transportation Plan, where we're evaluating hundreds of projects, we've got staff going through, just really looking at those numbers and doing a qualitative review. And especially when you're working at a regional level, I think it's important to be able to capture the more localized community issues that don't immediately stand out in a region-wide analysis. And one way that we were able to do this with our Metropolitan Transportation Plan development was, again, considering, we're working with hundreds of projects, at least hundreds of candidate projects that we're evaluating. We created a public web map where anyone could visit and make a project suggestion by drawing directly on the map. And also you could click on projects that were already identified and make comments on those projects right on the map. And in our most recent plan development, we had thousands of interactions on the map. So it was really successful, especially, compared to other public engagement activities we had done in the past. And it sounds like a lot to manage and call through, and it is. But being a digital platform, we were able to be strategic about the form and like the format of the responses that we were asking from people. And that being said, in an effort to balance the kind of the amount of information we were asking from people when they were making suggestions or comments, and considering how many fields are too many before they're going to give up because it's we're asking for too much information. We did not ask for demographic information, so we unfortunately weren't really, although we got a lot of responses and a lot of interactions, we didn't really know exactly who we were interacting with and who we were hearing from. So I do think the next time we do this engagement activity, we'll try to figure out how to better incorporate some of that information and really better understand who exactly we're hearing from, to the extent we can, and that the participants will volunteer that information. But I guess to bring it back to the question at hand, in addition to utilizing this qualitative information in the project evaluation process, we were also able to share these comments with our local planning partners. So, based on where the location of the comments, they were a lot of times very, very local in nature. This is an area where a lot of kids are walking to school, and maybe it's doesn't show up as a high crash location, but there's a lot of near misses. So it's that really that like community level localized data that has been really, we've been successful with this tool in gaining, and it's overall been really valuable to MORPC and our planning partners.
That's really great. Thank you for sharing. Kristen and Vinny, anything to add there? Would you say that your approaches to qualitative data and community input are similar to Maria's, different in any way?
I would say, I think Maria did a very comprehensive explanation of strategies that we use as well. There's the online approach, and then there is what we call the on-the-ground engagement. I think one dimension, which I'm sure they're following at MORPC, is the kind of is trying to engage people who would typically not be included. And so we have our language, multilingual outreach drives a lot of our public engagement now. And over the years, we found, this is a little anecdote, and I didn't think this was going to be the case, but people are using QR codes. But they are zooming in on a QR code. Say we've put up a banner in the bus, which has one of those QR codes, and people are downloading a lot of our surveys by just going to those QR codes, and so our intercept surveys in that sense have increased in volume in terms of participation. But we do try and get a sense of who is actually filling in the surveys. But as Maria mentioned, you can't ask too many questions, and people get kind of don't want to fill in their personal information, obviously.
Yes, and actually we have a question from one of our audience members on this exact topic, on your advice for focus groups of community surveys when people are uncomfortable sharing their demographic information. Do you have any best practices for cases like this?
I think you have to go to where the people are, right? So we very kind of we're strategic about when we're doing surveys, which neighborhood are our volunteers going to, or to kind of in an ad hoc way ask people to fill in the survey. We have people in buses. We've found that to be very successful to catch the kind of diversity to fill in our surveys. And we go to community forums, which are already been planned. Maybe there's a big forum on housing, on affordable housing. So we might show up at that and ask people to fill surveys. You have to get to where the people are. Or we'll go to a church on a Sunday morning to get the Latino community in a particular neighborhood, for example.
Absolutely. Kristen, did you experience challenges like this with the trail intercept surveys?
So we didn't actually conduct the intercept surveys. The project sponsor did that in-house with their own staff. So I don't know how much demographic data they actually collected, but what I will say is a really big challenge for us, and again, I'm on the consulting side, is when we're working through a scope for a project, and we're starting to run into some budget constraints and we need to cut somewhere. Oftentimes I see some of the public engagement get cut because it does take time and effort. And I just hope that, you know, if there's one thing you can take away from this, it's um, if you're not going to outsource the public engagement, find a way to do it. I think Vineet and Maria have talked about some of the strategies that they've used to get out to the community and leverage other organizations or leverage committees that might be available. But just want to reiterate how important it is that you actually have that qualitative community engagement and the feedback. And if you're going to the communities that you want to hear from, then maybe you don't have to worry so much about collecting the demographic data through surveys.
Right. And we have another question from an audience member, actually, that's very relevant to this topic. Beyond whether community engagement gets conducted at all, they're noting that a lot of private developer companies are still doing town hall meetings to meet their obligation for stakeholder engagement, so checking a box, as Judah noted earlier. And they're wondering, how should government incentivize participatory engagement in the inclusive and quality ways that you've been describing? Vineet, maybe can I ask you to respond to that?
Yeah, but it can be a challenge for sure, but what we require developers in the Boston area to do is to hold community engagement. And we sometimes will set the stage for them, making it clear that the presentation is independent of the city and we are reviewing the project as much as the community is. But we will create the forum for them to present their project, or we will create a committee that consists of local leaders, community leaders, that they will meet in advance of going to a larger public forum to get kind of more detailed feedback. So we have what are called advisory groups or project advisory groups for each of, particularly for the large developments. The public process is very engaged, and elected officials, state or a city councillor join city officials in that discussion. But that's a requirement of our developers.
I will also add that we've found that just offering multiple formats and multiple times of the day has for open houses or meetings has to get the most attendance. I mean, while we were really successful with virtual open houses or virtual meetings, a lot of stakeholders and professionals, if you do a virtual meeting over lunch, that's really convenient for them, or even a public meeting, professionals, it's easier for them to get to during the day, during work hours virtually, but also holding the same meeting with the same information, similar format, in person, multiple times a day. So I think that we've really found success. Just it feels like you're doing it too many times, but it's not too many times. It's enough to get all of the people to attend to fit their schedule.
Absolutely, and I think that relates to Vineet's point earlier, just meeting people where they are. We just have about 5 minutes left, so I want to conclude with a question that I'm sure is on many of our audience members' minds, which is, what advice would you give to first-time or previously unsuccessful applicants to Infrastructure Act competitive grants that could help them improve their applications? Kristen, could we start with you maybe?
Sure. I would say for first-time applicants, start preparing for your application now. well in advance of the notice of funding coming out. There's usually a pretty quick turnaround for those applications. And so any advanced work that you can do, gathering this data, doing any additional analysis that you think will be needed, review previous NOFOs, review the new programs. A lot of them have at least some guidance about the purpose and the eligible types of projects. Start collecting your letters of support, start having those conversations about getting support for the project. Be thinking about, how much funding you want to request versus how much local match you can have. And if you're going to be the only local match, or if you're going to have partnerships, you're going to have to demonstrate all of those agreements in your application. So the more upfront work you can do prior to the application, the more time you can actually spend on the application narrative once the notice of funding comes out. For applicants who have been unsuccessful in the past, don't stop trying. If you really believe that your project, is a good project and you really think it's competitive for federal funding, keep trying. These are highly competitive. USDOT is getting hundreds of applications every round of funding. So just because you didn't get selected doesn't mean it's a bad project. The other thing I would recommend is reach out to USDOT and see if they're willing to have a debrief with you about your previous applications. I know that in my experience, they've been very open to doing that. They're very candid in their responses, very honest, and will give you, and they do a lot of documentation and preparation for the debriefs that I've been in, and I very much appreciate that.
Those are great tips. Vineet, anything to add?
No, I think Kristen kind of covered most of them. I think that while it's important to get a good score on the quantitative criteria that you have to kind of the analysis that you have to do. I mean, remember there are hundreds of these applications coming in, so literally, I mean, this is how when you apply for a job, your resume has to look good. I mean, it's literally that kind of thing. You want to have a compelling project that looks attractive in the first place. It doesn't matter what the data says, but if your project is compelling and if it's been kind of represented in a way that's attractive, I think that it goes a long way. And I think that the money that you're asking for, the local match, is always a help, because it tells the reviewer in Washington that the city is, or whatever the community is committed already, because they have put in so much money into the project. And so they know that if they give that grant, it'll be put to good use, because there's already a project which has a commitment behind it.
Maria, last thoughts?
Yeah, so I think first, really focusing on the storytelling, similar to the qualitative versus quantitative, data that we talked about, tell a great story and supplement it, weave it together with the data. Second, I'll hammer home the regional collaboration. A lot of these discretionary programs really seem to emphasize the multi-jurisdictional projects. So, work with your local and regional partners to identify what are those bigger projects that you can work together on. And, as Kirsten mentioned, time it out, look at what projects are good fits for each program. And, I think, the collaboration goes a long way.
Great. We're just about out of time, but thank you so much for your time and your insights, Vineet, Maria, Kristen. I'll pass it back to Judah to wrap it up.
Great. Thanks so much, Sam. And again, echoing a huge thank you to our panelists, Maria, Kristen, and Vineet, for your time and your insights throughout the interview process in here today. Just another reminder to attendees, the event has been recorded and will be uploaded to the Urban website. And again, as has been said before, you'll receive an email notification when the forthcoming data guide is published. I want to thank everyone again for giving us the time today, and hope you all have a great rest of your week. Thanks again.